Hello, my friends, and welcome to Quartet. I'm John Petersen, and we're coming to you on a rainy March afternoon from Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, just down the road from Washington and Baltimore. And we come to you fortnightly like this to discuss the extraordinary times that we're living in. And I'm joined, as I always am, by our friends Gregg Braden and Kingsley Dennis. Hello, Gregg. Hi, Kingsley.
Good morning, John. Good morning, Kingsley. It's good to be with you today. We're missing Penny today, so we'll send our best to Penny on her travels, and I look forward to this conversation today.
Likewise, greetings, John, Gregg, everyone watching.
Yeah.
Good to be back.
Thank you both. And yes, our friend Penny Kelly, who is usually part of this quartet, is in traffic somewhere down in the great southeastern part of the United States in the middle of a long road trip, and she got stuck today in one way or another and can't be with us. And so we wish her well in her travels. So let's go to questions. We've had a nice set of comments and questions that have come in this time from our last session where we talked about kind of current events. Dee Dee Wood asked a couple of things. She said there's apparently a plan that from the World Economic Forum and others to create so much chaos and fear that we will turn to them, the World Economic Forum and its sponsors, for a solution that will include digital passports and currency. My question is this: what if we turn to ourselves instead? I'm going to ask Kingsley to say something about this, but let me first say that that's the essence of, I think, the whole evolutionary push, this awakening, if you will, that is going on. It is this kind of split between the technocracy and controlling us in the process, and the other way is this clear kind of movement inside and embracing the intrinsic kind of power that we have as human beings and our consciousness and our ability to create.
Well, John, I would add to what you're saying is that, what's happening across the world, of course, we see it very dominantly in a physical aspect, but it's also a psychological realm. It's a psychological contestation. And at this time, it's very important for people to maintain a psychological balance, because I think this whole aim of the chaos that Dee Dee Wood mentioned, that we've talked about and we know about, what it does, it kind of fragments the mind, fragments the psychological state. And so it defers closure, which means that when you have deferred closure, you seeking resolution, or you're seeking a body or an authority to give you resolution because you really long for that closure. And therefore, of course, if the solution comes across as digital IDs, etc., there'll be a great surge to embrace it just to have closure.
We are experiencing the World Economic Forum's idea of the Great Reset. This is their terminology, and it's not a secret. They're proud of it. They believe it's a good thing. COVID was certainly a part of that, and rather than looking at that as a temporary speed bump in the road of life, they viewed COVID as the opportunity to wipe the slate and start with a new economic system, new financial system, and a new world order in a very real sense, because they are now legally engaged with the United Nations. We're seeing trauma after trauma after trauma wearing people down to the point, and the financial trauma that's coming, which is a form of stress. And people will say, please fix this. And when people reach that point of saying, please fix this is a closure, I think, that Kingsley has mentioned, there is a plan. And that plan, I think, will be embraced.
Let me mention, by the way, that Penny Kelly was with us at Transition Talks here in Berkeley Springs this last weekend, and we had a wonderful time together. If you're interested in that 4-hour-long conversation about aliens and alien life and big changes and new kind of insights and epiphanies that she has had about what's coming downstream, all of which will affect you, our viewers for sure. You can find that information out at transitiontalks.org. And I will put in a plug for Gregg, who will be with us here in Berkeley Springs in September. And we're very much looking forward to that as well. As we all know, there's a great interest in the climate and climate change. And so much so that, as Gregg just has intimated, it's moving its way down into the United Nations and World Economic Forum and others, and being kind of inculcated into the policy decisions that are going forward. And all of those decisions are made in that space, at least, are being made based upon an assumption that the climate it's getting warm, and that it's going to get hot, and that's what and by the way, that's being forced by human beings and human activity, and the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There are serious and fundamental questions about that scenario. And there is a great deal of science that's coming out of Russia and other places as well that are suggesting that, in fact, that the climate and the changes that we have, again, as Gregg has talked about, is like everything else on this planet, is cyclical, and that these changes come and they go, and they've been with us forever, back for hundreds of thousands of years, and it's likely they will continue. More so, they're driven, it appears, a great deal by activity on the sun. That you can see a direct correlation between the kind of output from cosmic rays and energy from the sun, and not only the climate on the planet, but also the way human beings behave. And you get social behavior that generates wars and peace and other kinds of things that are direct correlation with the sun. And so, to the extent that it suddenly becomes clear that increasingly that it's not going to get hot, even though in this transition period there are very cold places and very hot places, and and in time, what it looks like, as a matter of fact, in another year or two, it's going to become very clear that it's going to get cold. What I wanted to suggest that our conversation today to be around, what can we do about climate change? Is it possible to influence it directly? Or do we really have to just be responsive to the thing and try to get out in front of it, and in the way that we do with everything else that happens on the planet? And is it kind of hubris to suggest that we human beings can change the climate of the whole planet? Maybe it's a whole lot bigger than we are.
This is a topic I love to talk about, John. I rarely have the opportunity. As I think you and our listeners know, I'm a degreed earth scientist. I'm a degreed geologist. I've been following climate since 1970s, when I was working in the industry as a computer geologist. And it's a very complex subject. Unfortunately, it's been politicized, just as the pandemic was politicized. And there's a narrative in the mainstream that is leading the public to a certain set of beliefs to support policies that are being promoted by a relatively small number of people. The climate of our planet is determined by Earth's location in space. And Earth does a dance based upon the tilt, the angle, and the wobble. Three separate movements that are plotted and charted independently. And every once in a while, a couple of those movements will converge on a chart, and we see things begin to happen here on Earth. We have been led to believe that we're living a time of extremes in terms of climate, that the CO2 levels are higher than they've ever been, the Earth is warmer than it's ever been, and it's absolutely not true. We, as a society, like to think in terms of stability, and the fact that the climate is a dynamic system, it's always changing, bothers people. a lot of the data is coming from the UN and computer models that are so flawed that even when the dates have already passed and the information is known, it's plugged into the models still don't talk about what happened on those dates. So the models are, in my opinion, a dangerous way to look at climate. If we were honest with ourselves and accepted that we are in a time of change and we adapt to the change to the degree that we can, number one. Number two, we have to honestly say we're contributing to the CO2 because our industry is putting CO2 into the air. This is where it gets tricky, John, because if the powers that are pushing the narrative honestly believed that CO2 was the problem, they would have adapted the forms of energy that produce zero greenhouse gases that we've had since the 1960s. And they are not adopting those. So they're pushing a narrative on the one hand, yet they're going with the technologies that are, for whatever reason, economic reasons, oil and gas have been more favorable. So we have the technologies, we could implement them today, and we've talked about them. Thorium as a base load source of energy is a perfect example. And it's not being discussed. So it's very complex. And what I see, the only way that you could stop climate, I actually was at a conference and the scientists were talking about this. The only way to stop climate change is to change the tilt, the angle, and the wobble of Earth's location in space. And they had ways of doing that. And in my opinion, there are some things we shouldn't mess with.
I have to begin by saying on this occasion, I'm not in agreement with Gregg or on the same page of our friend, because Gregg said that he loves to talk about climate, whereas I don't. And the reason I don't is because the same thing which Gregg brought up is that it's a highly politicized subject. Your question was, can we do anything about climate change? And my initial response would be, why would we want to? Yeah. Climate change is a perfectly natural part of Gaia's self-organizing system. If we didn't have climate change, we would not have evolution on this planet to the degree we have it now. I mean, climate change has many forms, the changing of the water systems. As we know, there's been pole shifts, the adaptations to the sun effects, as you mentioned. These are part of an evolving planet, and life on this planet has to adapt to it. Then, of course, we have to ask the question, what do we mean by climate change? Because, you know, everyone has a different reference to this. And because it's a kind of lump term put together. And many people, when they talk about climate change, using the rabbit fingers, would be talking or referring to the politicized narrative. And that narrative is, as you say, one of hubris. It's a one of geoengineering intervention and social cultural control intervention. And as Gregg said, the knowledge has been there for a long time. If they wanted to change, they could have done it. Why are they at the same time intervening with geoengineering? And we know that they have the technology which is interfering with the cloud bases, with the electromagnetic environment, and this is unnatural and should not be happening, because if we as humanity stepped back and allowed Gaia to have a natural systems, we'd learn how to fit in to adapt to those systems. Now, on the other side, climate change, there's the question of pollution. Yes, humanity is polluting. We have polluting systems, polluting industries, polluting lifestyles, but pollution should not be lumped together with climate change. I think we have to distinguish that.
But the point is that carbon dioxide is necessary. If we drop below 180 parts per million CO2, Earth begins to die. What we're really saying, John, is we want the climate to adapt to our lives and where we've built our cities. And is it reasonable to expect that we can engineer a planet to do that, for the climate to conform to our lifestyles.
Oh, I would agree with you. And you had raised that point earlier about all this engineering ideas that they have throwing soot on top of the snow in the northern latitudes and so on. I mean, you just really don't know how this thing works.
The discrepancy in the narratives are so frustrating. And what really, I find so frustrating is the miseducation. I would say that the first step is each person needs to do their own educational endeavor, because the external sources are not going to educate you. So find out, for example, where you're living. Is there a way that you can adapt your abode, your where your home is living, if you can't move? Is the home energy efficient? Is there ways to tweak it to make amends? Are you vulnerable in your lifestyle?
We've talked about this briefly in another quartet as well. It is only green when the solar panels are on your roof. To build those solar panels is horribly fossil fuel intensive, using toxic materials, rare earth minerals, 17 rare earth minerals. The data has been cherry picked. And if you look at climate data and compare it to 20 years ago or 50 or 100 years ago, Mother Earth doesn't work on those kinds of time frames when it comes to climate. And so it can be made to look like Earth is broken.
This climate change theme is linked with consumerism, lifestyle and consumerism narrative, and if we have to be, we have to be resilient. So I think the first step is to look at ourselves and say, how am I as a consumer? Because if we need to be resilient in the future, we need to have resources. We need to bring things back. Now, how many things are going out? Now, every month, how much money and resources do we spend on latest updates, latest gadgets, getting a new clothes, getting a new fashion? If we have a climatic event, if Gaia wants to have a disruption, those things, they're not going to help you. But if we can start saying now, that expenditure, I'm going to cut down on my expenditure, and I'm going to relocate that to more resilient resources. I'm going to stop buying this every month, and I'm going to do it to buy some equipment for the home, for some seed beds, and maybe the climatic agenda, if one thing it does good, is to bring home priorities which we should be shifting to make us more resilient.
I agree, Kingsley, and I think even if the climate were not changing, it makes sense to move to more localized forms of living, because those have proven throughout history in many indigenous communities and civilizations to be more resilient to whatever change is happening. So localized sources of energy, whatever makes sense in your geographic location. Localized economies, localized agriculture, farm to table, flies in the face of everything that's being promoted by the Great Reset, because they want us living clustered into relatively few population centers, which is the last thing you want in the middle of a pandemic, by the way. They want us clustered and not living in rural lifestyles, not living close to nature, not having that natural connection. And this is a fundamental shift that is being pushed through a very sexy and clever marketing campaign targeted at the younger generation.
Yeah, and I'll tell you this, that big cities are the places that are going to be the most vulnerable to all of these supply chain and other kind of issues, and therefore more controllable, I think, is what the objective is likely to be. So thanks to Gregg, and thanks to Kingsley, and thank you to you for being a part of all of this.